In late 1984, I got a request from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They wondered if I could go to Argentina for a few weeks to give the newly established democratic government some advice. It came after the end of roughly 8 years of rule by a military dictatorship called the junta. And during that time, thousands of Argentine men, women, and children disappeared. They became known as the desaparecidos, the disappeared ones. The new government was trying to find out what happened to the disappeared. Scenes like this were being played out all over Argentina. After attempting to recruit a team of professionals and finding that none existed in my area of forensic anthropology in Argentina at the time, because the work was considered very dangerous at the time. At this time, the military could have come back in any moment. And the people who would be doing these kinds of investigations would be on the next round of disappearances. I was very fortunate, though. The word had gone out over the student grapevine that, I needed some help. And a very gallant little group of Argentine anthropology and medical students came forth and volunteered. And so I decided I would stay down and see if I could train them. I didn't have time for any classroom teaching. We just had to go to work out in the cemeteries where the disappeared were buried, and we spent days and days and days exhuming the graves and taking the bones back to the laboratory to be examined, measured, and do the other things that forensic anthropologists do. After we'd been working for several months, the junta, the 9 individuals who served as the military dictators of Argentina during this period, were brought to trial. And we were asked to present the forensic evidence at the trial. We were only allotted a couple of hours of testimony. We told the story of the young woman that we had found, and we were able to get her identified as Liliana Pereira, 21-year-old bank clerk who was 7 months pregnant at the time of her disappearance in the city of Mar del Plata in 1977. When we exhumed the skeleton, we found that the skull was shattered into between 15 and 20 fragments. And when we got it together, we could see that the fracture patterns that we observed are very typical of what we see with close-range shotgun blasts to the head. And in the grave, scattered amongst these bones, we also found several badly corroded shotgun pellets. This is typical of someone who's been executed with a shotgun. And that was a common means of killing the desaparecidos in Argentina. And this was one reason we selected the case, because a particularly vicious practice of the junta and the death squads in Argentina was that if a female detainee was found to be pregnant, they would keep her alive long enough so that she could have the child. And our testimony contributed to the conviction of the junta. So there was some justice brought to the desaparecidos. Our work starts in the field, at the grave. And we have to first find the graves. We have various ways of doing that. But then once we begin our exhumation, we have to use the same very painstaking, meticulous techniques that archaeologists have always used to recover prehistoric remains. Because a human skeleton consists of over 200 bones and a number of teeth, and each one of those can tell us something about the life history of that individual in terms of identification and the cause of death. So they all have to be recovered, along with bullets, clothing that might help us get the person identified, personal effects, and things of that sort. And the field work is very tedious, very, very hard, no matter which country we work in. It has to be part of the judicial process. We can't just go out and start digging up skeletons. Right from the first in Argentina, when we were doing these exhumations, we were doing them under a judge's order, and when we started out, of course, we had always had a police presence, and that was particularly for the students rather nerve-wracking in the early days, because in Argentina the police functioned as a fourth arm of the military and were responsible for many of the disappearances and deaths. Once a grave is open, we not only have to remove the larger bones and catalog them and very carefully and preserve them, but all of the earth from the grave has to be sifted, screened, as we would in an ordinary archaeological site, to recover small items like bullet fragments, teeth. And here we are, early days. You can see that's a very primitive screen. But at that time, with no funding, one of our team members, Luis Fonderreader, swiped a screen from his mother's house. And you can see it wasn't a very high-tech operation. But fortunately, you can do archaeology with very simple tools and equipment, brushes, trowels, some string and some stakes, and you're in business. Once the bones arrive in the laboratory, they have to be very carefully arranged. We arrange them in what we call anatomical order, just as if the person was lying on the table. And then they have to be carefully cleaned, sometimes with just gentle running water to get rid of any adherent soil. And once that's done, then we begin our more detailed examination of the bones, which takes a lot of careful measurements. The bones of the arms and legs, we measure their length in millimeters, and we have formulas that enable us to calculate the person's stature within a certain range of error. And other features on the bone tell us something about the person's age, gender, and if there are signs of old diseases and injuries that might be reflected in that person's medical history. We have several objectives in conducting these kinds of investigations. The first is to collect the forensic evidence in the hopes that eventually some justice can serve the needs, such as we did in the Junta trial in Argentina. That doesn't often happen, unfortunately, because very often these people get amnesty in one form or another, but we still have that obligation to collect the forensic evidence and write it up so that even many years down the road, it could be presented in court. Another reason we do this is that even though justice is not always served, at least it puts it on the historical record that these kinds of crimes occurred. And that prevents the revisionists who are always out there from coming along 10 or 20 years later and saying, you know, these things really didn't happen. A third objective is, of course, we have the obligation, after we have examined the bones, to return them when possible to their families so that they can be memorialized as they wish. In the early 1990s, the peace process in El Salvador was initiated, and part of that required the investigation of some of the crimes and atrocities that occurred on both sides. And the Argentine team had developed an international reputation, and they were called to help in the investigation of one particular massacre that had shocked the world. The massacre at El Mozote occurred in 1981 when a very elite counterinsurgency battalion of the El Salvadoran Army, which was U.S. trained and equipped, rounded up all of the people in 5 small villages that compose the hamlet that's called El Mozote. And all of the people, with the exception of some survivors, were executed. I think that they separated the adult men, the adult women, and the children, and they took all of the children and took them to a little stone house next to the church and herded them in there along towards evening. The soldiers came up to the casita and simply sprayed inside the doorway and one window. This shows a little place. These are meters, and you can see it's a very tiny place. These were children ranging from babes in arms up to 11 or 12. And here you see the commingled skeletal remains that had lain there for many years. And you can see what the technical challenge that the team members were faced with in trying to meticulously sort out these thousands of bones to make sure that we have the skeleton of each individual. In these communities, by returning their dead to them, they can see some actual justice, real justice being done, that it helps them to heal and makes it less likely that their unhappiness will turn to hatred and vengeance. In 1990, with the aid of the Chileans and the Argentines, we went to Guatemala and we got a team of Guatemalans started. We did mass graves of Kurdish victims of the Iraqi forces who had killed many Kurds during the late 80s. We had Guatemalans, Chileans, and Argentines all working on the same team. And so they all know each other, they all work, still working in their own countries, but they've gone global. In 1984, 85, we had this little mom and pop operation that we were on the streets of Buenos Aires, and now we see people in teams working on these problems all over the world. We're very proud of that. Our work in Argentina was the first in which the forensic sciences were used in the investigation of human rights abuses.